Okay, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, Buffalo, New York. It is the 16th of May, 2007, approximately 9 a.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Patrick L. Johnson. Place of birth is Buffalo, New York, October 4th, 1955.
What was your educational background prior to entering service?
High school, Kenmore West, as we discussed earlier, here in Western New York.
Were you did you enlist or were you drafted?
No, I enlisted in January of 1973.
Okay, why did you decide to enlist?
Well, it was a long story. I'll make it a short story, but it was a long story. In my senior year, my dad and I were talking about the 5 colleges that I had applied to. And one day we sat down in a very serious discussion about which one to select, and he told me I had 4 choices. And I said, but I applied to five colleges, and he said, but your choices are the Army, Navy, Air Corps, Marines, so you pick one of those colleges and I'll be glad to support it. So I picked the Navy, and the next day I went down to the Naval building downtown and enlisted in the Navy. I enlisted in January of that year because the Navy at the time was offering promotion where if you joined the Navy earlier, although you wouldn't actually go into the service and be active until later in the summer, so you could have your summer home after your senior year. They did it for pay purposes, where you would get paid 8 months earlier than had I just enlisted in August. So, and as a result, to answer your question earlier about Vietnam era veteran or Vietnam veteran, whatever, that evidently had put me into the Vietnam era veteran category because the war did not end until I believe February of 1973. So
Right.
I just found out that recently through the Veterans Organization locally.
Okay, where did you go for your basic training?
To Orlando, which at the time was one of 3 in the country. One was in San Diego, one in Great Lakes, naturally where it is today. And Orlando is the only co-ed Navy recruiting station in the country.
Was this the first time you were ever really away from home?
When I was a kid, when I was 15, I went around the country with my father's nurse and her husband, my brother, for a month. But never away from home alone amongst people I'd never met prior to that time.
What was it like?
Scary at first. For anybody that's ever joined the military, the first day in boot camp can be a little harrowing because of the tactics they have to use to indoctrinate you in the military versus that what you just came from. And I miss my family. I have a rather large family. I have 5 sisters and a brother. My mom and dad who all left me at the airport that day to say goodbye for 7 weeks.
Okay, how long were you in Orlando?
I was in Orlando from August of '73 until October.
Okay. What was your basic training like?
It was interesting. At the time, I had many folks before me in high school in the military, some of which came back to tell their stories. I think we all amplify boot camp stories to scare the next guy, right? But Orlando was kind of unique in that it was a brand new recruiting station, and it was we did not have to do, for instance, we didn't have to do our laundry. Our laundry came back warm every day. And I heard of other areas like Great Lakes to this day. I guess they still have to do their own laundry, and it was a little easier environment than I'd ever expected. We had a company commander who was kind of spirited in the way he wanted to get 80 guys to kind of rally together. He would, if we had certain tests that he would take as part of the syllabus of boot camp, and if you were to grade out with a 4.0 score, he would literally hide you into the back of his El Camino vehicle and take you off base and go water skiing at his house on the water, which is illegal, I guess. But and one of us got caught. Actually, one of the guys got a sunburn from water skiing half the afternoon. And one of the inspectors that inspect you at least once a week out on the grinder noticed that his tan was a little darker than most people. So, but I guess Jex is the gentleman's name. He was a friend of this guy, so nobody really got him into trouble. But I know he was kind of a comical guy. When we were at attention getting inspected, he would get on the inspector's bike. They would come around on bikes to inspect the different teams and different companies on the grinder out in front of front of our building, and he would ride backwards sitting on the handlebars on this guy's bike just to get some of us to laugh. And naturally, when you laughed, then you got in trouble and did push-ups or run. You had to run or whatever. So he was kind of a spirited company commander.
After Orlando, where did you go? In specialized training?
Yes, I came home initially for I think a week or two, and then I went out to San Diego, the National Training Center in San Diego, which at the time was where all of the enlistees that were going on to higher education electronics in specialized fields went there for what they call basic electricity and electronics program, or BEEP school is what we all called it, and it was the core course that you had to take before you went on to an A school, wherever that may be. Might happen to be Treasure Island, California. I was in San Diego probably no more than 6 weeks. I recall leaving there in the November-December timeframe of 1973 to go on to my next duty station.
And what was that?
Treasure Island, California. Treasure Island was the receiving depot on the West Coast for Vietnam veterans that came back with particular issues, mostly mental-related issues. But it also housed the only electronic warfare school for the U.S. Navy, which has since moved to Pensacola, Florida. Treasure Island was a very nice place. I lived on the third floor of the barracks there with a view of the actual city of San Francisco. I think I had 3 roommates. And when we looked out our window at San Francisco, the right side of the window was the Golden Gate Bridge, and the left side was the Oakland San Francisco Bay Bridge. So the whole view of San Francisco was in our window every day. And you can imagine with the sun setting in the west behind the city, just an incredible view every night. People would pay millions, and in fact they do now, I believe. The city of San Francisco owns the island that was originally opened in the early 1900s for an exhibition in the San Francisco area. There's a natural island called Yerba Buena, which is the Pacific Fleet, Coast Guard headquarters. Still today, and Yerba Buena connects to Treasure Island via causeway. And Treasure Island was a man-made island, maybe early 1900s. It's just a beautiful place. I guess the city of San Francisco owns it now. In fact, none of the places that I have stayed, to include homes when I was in the military, stand any longer. They're all gone, which is kind of ironic. They don't tend to keep the housing as long as civilian housing. Probably because of the turnover and just the general use. It's a little more abusive than standard.
How long were you at Treasure Island?
I was Treasure Island from November or December of 73 until August of 74. It's what they called the A school, where you would learn both operation and maintenance of a couple of systems. One was the WLR-1 Charlie, which is a wideband receiver to receive signals for what was the former Soviet Union, which was the biggest perceived threat at the time during the Cold War. And we would monitor, using the system, we would monitor subsurface, surface, and air threats to the ship, signal recognition patterns of different radars and things. And then there were some active systems that we would use to jam signals if there was an incoming missile and you had to jam the warhead and things. So you both operated and maintained the system, which is kind of unique to the Navy, because when you get underway, you can't leave your maintainer back at the pier. You have to really have a person that's dual-hatted in both operation and maintenance because of the unique aspects when a ship leaves.
Okay. Do you think by the time you got on your ship, your assignment, you were well trained? I
was. My first ship was the USS Newport News, which was stationed in Norfolk. And,
now, when did you go to that?
Actually, when I left San Francisco, I came home for 30 days and then flew to England with the hope of catching the USS Newport News, which was the second fleet flagship in hopefully in harbor in England, but had left to go out on what they called a Comp 2X exercise back then, which was a large exercise in the north where you would show force to the Soviets by putting an armada of ships that would sail up north of Norway and do some exercise just to show them that we could move that many people and ships up there. And because the ship was underway and it was in the fall, they didn't want to send me out to an aircraft carrier, fly me to an aircraft carrier and then highlight me to the Newport News. So I waited 30 days and I worked at a base called Mildenhall Air Force Base in the center of England, up near Shipley Hills, England, north of Ely, the cathedral town, for 30 days, and then I literally flew on a different aircraft, military aircraft, from there into Oslo, Norway, and caught my ship in Oslo port. In the fjord.
Now, what kind of things did you do while you were in England?
What most 18-year-old guys did. I shot darts and drank beer.
So you were the only Navy man on the Air Force Base, or basically?
From what I remember, there was one other Navy guy waiting to go to the same ship there. And but for 30 days, we just washed cars, naturally washed the general's car. There was one unique aspect of Mildenhall, is that one day I was asked to drive a step van to the end of the runway with some news media. They didn't tell us initially what it was, but when we got out there, it was obvious. The SR-71, long, sleek, black jet and spy plane, was making its trip from Mildenhall Air Force Base to Los Angeles. And it wanted to film it because it was supposed to set a record for time, and it made it in, I think it was 3 hours and 46 minutes from the time it left the end of that runway to the time it got to Los Angeles. And I understand it refueled over New Jersey and route, so you can imagine how fast it was going. I recall the guys wore spacesuits because altitude they fly, and the plane actually leaked fuel at ground level because when they flew up, I guess the metal contracts and everything would come together in the air, and it would actually drip fuel on the ground. So kind of a unique aspect for a Navy guy in an Air Force base to see a secretive plane at the time. So the rest of the time was just enjoying England. I know we went down to London for a day, toured London, but mostly it was just in the Mildenhall area, stuff in the base.
Okay, when you arrived on your ship finally, what was your assignment on the ship?
My initial assignment was electronic warfare technician, and I can recall coming on board that day. Actually, it was kind of something kind of unique happened as we were flying over to meet the ship in Norway. On this plane we were on, there was a Navy captain on board. There must have been, I'd say, 6 or 7 enlisted Navy people, and we were all sitting together in the back of the plane. And as we were about to land in Oslo, I know the captain asked us who's picking us up at the airport, and he said we didn't have rides. We were going to get taxis and find our way to the ship somehow. And he didn't like the idea that enlisted guys had to spend their own money to go to the ship, so he called some cars as soon as we landed and said just wait there for about 15 minutes, and sure enough, buses came from everywhere. I remember there were small, like 8-person vans picked us up and took us back to the ship, and he actually brought us on board, which was kind of unique. And he was part of the 2nd Fleet flagship staff that was part of our crew. A very nice guy.
What was daily life like on board the ship?
Initially, confusing because the Newport News was that it was the last all-gun heavy cruiser in the U.S. Navy inventory. It's a beautiful ship. It had teakwood decks to absorb some of the shock of the big 8-inch guns going off. It was really a model ship. The captain just loved to show her off. And we had a lot of dignitaries come on board as we sailed through the northern part of Europe. But I remember going on the ship, there were, I think, over 1,500 people on board at the time, and it was just so confusing to find out how to get from where you slept to where you worked to where you ate. And if you really didn't have someone that kind of took you by hand through the ship the first couple of weeks, you would have just been lost. It didn't take long, though, to assimilate and find out where everything was, but there were many parts of the ship I never saw in a year. And we ended up leaving Oslo and traveling to many different ports in the northern part of Europe. I know we went into Copenhagen and Amsterdam, went back to England, and we went to Lisbon, Portugal before we came back to put the ship to rest. We actually decommissioned it when we came back.
So how long were you on the Newport News?
That would have been October of 74 until July of 75, roughly in that time frame. We decommissioned the ship in Portsmouth, Virginia, in the yards there, and we were all presented certificates as plank preservers, as newer guys from the ships were plank owners in July. and my parents came down, my wife, and my girlfriend at the time, and her mom all came down to see the decommissioning, which is really a kind of a sad ceremony to see a ship get taken out of the inventory.
Do you know if it has ever been recommissioned?
No, in fact, we're probably shaving with it. It was, for the longest time in Philadelphia shipyards, when I used to fly into Philadelphia for work, you'd see it, if you landed a particular cardinal heading, you'd see it on the right-hand side as you went in. And then it left and went up to a shipyard in the Great Lakes and got cut up there, I understand.
All right, what was your next assignment?
After the Newport News, I got orders to the USS Vogelgesang, which was a Naval Reserve Force destroyer out of Newport, Rhode Island. That was a much smaller presence. It wasn't as ominous when you went on board. As far as number of people, we only had a crew of 150 men. And it was a great ship. You got to know a lot of the guys. I think all veterans would agree that the friendships you have in the Navy, I don't think you'd ever have as close in the civilian communities you did in the service.
Mm-hmm.
You tended to really rely on each other a lot more on a daily basis. So I was on the USS Vogelgesang in Newport for 2 years, until I got out in August of 1977.
Now, was it different sailing on a ship that small compared to a heavy cruiser?
Very much so, because even your relative rank on board the Newport News versus the Vogelgesang, let's say at the time I was a third-class petty officer on the Newport News versus a third-class petty officer on the Vogelgesang. Your duties as a third-class petty officer on the Vogelgesang were much greater than they could ever have been on the Newport News, just because you had a smaller crew. We were really only manned to about 50% or maybe a little bit more to the levels that you needed to run the ship efficiently, because as a Naval Reserve destroyer, we have the reservists from the New England area come on board once a month, and we pull out to sea and actually do exercises with them, and they would be the other complement of the crew. But we would go out alone with just 150, 160 of us, and we'd just pull later, more hours to get things done. But yeah, it was very nice. I like the size of the ship. It was different at sea too, obviously. The Newport News was a rather large ship, and it was a heavy ship, so it didn't really take the effects of the swells as much as the Vogelgesang did. The Vogelgesang, as tin can sailors like to call them, they really are corks popping around in the ocean. Just a different ride. Fortunately, I wasn't one of the ones that got sick at sea. So.
Now, what were your duty assignments? Were they similar to the Newport News?
They were, but more senior. I would have to make more senior decisions on a daily basis relative to the threats that faced the ship, and to the part of the job we had was not only receiving the signals of the different former Soviet Union ships or aircraft, but you would have to identify them and also pass them along, and we would tape them and send them on to electronics intelligence centers on the East Coast to make sure that they all received the same data that we received, in case there was a new sensor out there that the government had not seen yet. So we would literally tape all the radars that were radiating, and it was very detailed. We would utilize crystal controlled receivers in order to take a look at the fingerprints of the radars from the Soviet Union to see if anything was unique or changed from the uniqueness of them. And then we would send those tapes out to an intelligence center, electronic intelligence center in Maryland to review them.
Did you ever shadow any Soviet ships or submarines closely, or?
Very rarely would you have a combatant off of New England. You'd have them off of Norfolk, you'd have them off of Jacksonville. You'd have them, the only time we would ever see any clear potential violation of international waters was what they called AGIs, or intelligence collectors, which looked like medium-sized fishing boats with no nets, all antennas. And they would come to within 12 miles of the shore, mostly off of Groton, Connecticut, because they wanted to monitor the new submarines coming out of Groton. So we would go out and take pictures of them and moon them, or whatever else we wanted to do for the day. And mostly I would take pictures of the antenna arrays on board the ship to see if anything was different from the last time we saw an AGI. They used to have a term called a snooping team on board that would be called away whenever we got within a couple thousand yards of an AGI, just to take pictures of the antennas, because you can tell by the relative size of the antenna what the frequency ranges were, and then we could determine somewhat what they were trying to collect from us. So, but no, we never saw a surface combatant. We saw one sub pop up one day that we taped off of Groton, and we saw a number of bear deltas. Saw in the sense we saw their electronic fingerprint radar. We didn't physically see them. They were the heavy bombers, and still exist, I believe, that would fly a route down the East Coast, which made Washington nervous because they got pretty close to the coast and would fly down to Cuba and back. But it was a pretty regular occurrence. So we expected them and just monitored their transit down to Cuba.
Okay. Were there any incidents that you remember more than others? Something that was kind of amusing or inspirational, or?
We had a very unique captain on board who, Captain Hebner, who used to come into the electronic surface warfare center where I worked on board, and we had two captain's chairs, one in front of the equipment, the passive equipment I mentioned earlier, and one in front of the active equipment that would do the jamming of an incoming missile. And for some reason, because of the white noise, what I'll call white noise in the room where I was taping and the radios would be on and I'd be talking to other ships, and he would like to come in there and fall asleep because it just put him to sleep. You know? I guess I put my wife to sleep too, but anyway. Captain Hebner one day was given orders to actually try to infiltrate a carrier group off of Norfolk. I think it was a Carrier America. And his orders were to take the USS Vogelgesang and try to penetrate the outer perimeter of the carrier group, and there were a number of ships that were given orders to do that, to see if the carrier battle group could adequately identify a threat to the group, what they did relative to syllabus and how they attacked the threat, which was us, and go on. So he sat down with certain members of the crew, senior members, and said, how do you think we can pull this off? And we had just come out of the Boston Naval shipyards, and we put on a new radar on board our ship called, I think it was a Deca 1500, Deca being the name of the company. And we would use these radars to come into port because it had a much higher pulse repetition rate, smaller pulse width, which would give you greater definition of buoys and landmarks and entrances to tight waterways like Newport Harbor was. It was deep, but it was very thin by Navy standards. And we told the captain that there's a book in the Navy, just referred to it as a gray book, that had all the world's ships' radars in it, and then we mapped them to shipped by hull number. And since we had just come out of the yards and there were no updates to the publications, that particular radar wasn't on board our ship yet. So my counterpart, the electronic warfare guy on board, the Carrier America, or any of the picket ships around it in its battle group, wouldn't know that a Deca 1500 was potentially the USS Vogelgesang. So we recommended to my boss, electronic warfare first class Ryan Whitney, that we could, if we just went whatever the natural cruise speed was of a cruise ship, turned on the Deca 1500, which has the same radar fingerprints as a commercial cruise ship, turned on all the lights of the ship, which was a violation of normal Navy policy, and just had a party, we'd look like a cruise ship. And that's exactly what we did. And when we got through the outer pickets of the ships, we had ships from that group turn on their fire control radars on us, which is pretty standard when someone's transitioning through a battle group. But they never recognized it as a potential naval boat versus a commercial aircraft. And when you got to within, I think it was a half mile of the carrier, you were supposed to shoot off a flare, which we did. And as soon as we did, all hell broke loose. The captain was thrilled. He got through the outer perimeter of this battle group. He got all kinds of accolades by the destroyer squadron commander, destroyer squadron 28. I remember when we got back to Newport, shared all of that with his crew because we were a small crew. But that was one of the more fun things we did at sea. We also had our issues with fires and things that you do on board. I recall being in Jacksonville, and I was in charge of the quarterdeck. Whenever you're a second class or higher on a smaller ship, you give you the quarterdeck watch officer. Usually in a larger ship, it actually is a commissioned officer, not an enlisted senior petty officer. And I happen to have the quarterdeck watch officer duties one day in Jacksonville, Florida, when we were waiting for a full Navy captain and his crew to come on board to do what they call an in-serve inspection. In-service stands for in-service. Every 5 years, the Navy ships have an in-serve inspection to see if they're deemed seaworthy, and they literally go over every part of the ship from electronics to, they go into the boiler to see if it's seaworthy for the propulsion system, and they write up a report, and it's really a major scorecard for the camera, or for the captain, because it really tells his boss whether or not he's been maintaining the ship like he's supposed to. Because it's an expected life of every ship, and each captain has to understand that. And as the captain was coming over this nested set of 4 destroyers that we had in Jacksonville, one of the gentlemen on board, someone must have thrown a cigarette and it caught what we call the flag bag on the port and starboard side of every ship. Is a structure that has international semi-4 flags and international flags that we raise on the yard arms, and the cigarette hit this thing and immediately put this thing, engulfed it in flames. So I had to tell the in-serve captain to please stay off the ship, and we had to run up there and put that thing out. So it was kind of embarrassing to hear somebody coming on board to look at your seaworthiness. At the same time, you're in flames and under siege trying to get the thing out. But everything worked out okay.
Toward the end of Vietnam, there were some problems on some of the ships with racial relations. Did you have any problems on your ship at all?
Newport News once, but I didn't sense that, certainly on the Newport News, there was a greater race issue than there was on the smaller one. I don't recall any race-related issues on the smaller ship, the Vogelgesang. Newport News had something with 1,500 people, size of some small towns in the U.S. The carriers, we understand, had much more severe racial problems, unfortunately.
Okay. Are there any other things you think you'd like to add?
No, I enjoyed the Navy. I know that they asked me if I would stay in to go to the officer candidate school at Newport when Henry and I decided to come back to Buffalo in the summer of '77. Which we're happy we did, actually. But no, I enjoyed it, 4 years. Met a lot of good friends that I still have today. A lot of fond memories.
When you got out, did you make use of the GI Bill?
I did. In fact, the day I got out, the very day I got out of the Navy, I went to Canisius College and used the GI Bill for 2 years there.
Okay. Did you, I think you answered this, did you stay in contact with anyone that served with you?
Oh yeah, very much so. In fact, I stay in contact with Captain Hebner that I mentioned earlier, and Captain Razar, his replacement, who was the captain just before I got out, who was pushing me hard to go to the officer candidate school. Captain Razar and I just emailed each other within the last couple of weeks. He lives retired in Florida, and Captain Hebner is retired in Middletown, Rhode Island. So, yeah. And a crew, we've lost one of our closest crew members, Dana DeWitt, recently to a heart attack at 50, a year ago Christmas, which was tough to take. But most of the core part of the crew that I was close to, I've kept in contact with. Yeah.
Have there ever been any reunions from either ship?
Yeah, the Newport News has a reunion every July in Norfolk, which is heavily attended, I understand. I've never been. The Vogelgesang, to my knowledge, has never had one. They both have websites, but in the Newport News advertise their reunion every year. The Vogelgesang, I don't think it was ever advertised one or had one, but it was a much smaller ship. As I said, it was only 150 guys. But the core part of your division, like the operations division, which I was part of, I see them. I have seen those guys routinely over the years. Been to their homes, and we've had our own reunions, if you will.
Have you, with the Naval Park, with the cruiser and the destroyer here, have you ever been on them, or have you been there that often?
I've been to the Naval Park. Ironically enough, those two size ships were the size I was on. So that one's a light guided cruiser, I believe. Mine was a heavy cruiser. And the destroyer was a little older than mine, although they were both Gearing class destroyers. The Sullivans is, I think, at least 10 years prior to the Vogelgesang class, Gearing class of ships. So, but they look exactly like my ship did. If you didn't have a god's eye view of the deck on the other one, you'd think it was, and if it had 8-inch guns, you'd think it was a Newport News. No, but I've never been down there. I know my father was a model airplane enthusiast, and he donated aircraft of that time to the museum, which I've not been down to see either, so I should probably go do that now that you've reminded me.
What kind of work did you do after you came out of service?
I was at Canisius College for a couple of years and worked at the college in the physics lab there, and then went on to a company, at the time it was called Sierra Research Corporation, a private company here locally. I joined them as an electronic technician in 1979, in February 1979, which had direct applicability to the work I did in the Navy.
How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
At the front end of the interview, I mentioned that I thought I had 5 choices. My father told me I had 4. Clearly, he envisioned something I needed more than I knew I needed. And I think had he not done that, I would not be in the job I am today or be as happy I am in my work environment as I am today. I think it dramatically affected and changed who I was in high school to who I am, or who I was certainly when I got out of the Navy. And even more so, ironically enough, when I was in boot camp, the night before I left, my dad and I were in the backyard, and he said, "You know, son, all I can tell you is either you're going to come out an admiral or you're going to come out in jail. I don't know what, but I don't think there's going to be anything in between." I looked at him and I said, "Well, that's pretty diverse since I'm enlisted and I can't become an admiral, right?" But about a month later, I had the honor of being named the company honorman of my boot camp. And they sent my mom and dad a letter saying that there were tickets in the VIP section of the stands for all of the company honormen of the 12 companies in that year. We were company 212. And my father didn't believe it. He thought it was a joke, or I wrote the letter, I guess. But it was from the captain of the base in Orlando. And he sent my mom and my brother Pete, who was a sophomore student at the University of Notre Dame. And Pete came down with a camera and with my mom. We had a good time. Surprised me in line. They didn't answer, so I didn't think anybody was coming. But it was very nice to see my mom and my brother down there. So I would have to say, to make it a one-reeler on your question, I think the Navy had probably, other than my wedding to Anne Marie, was probably the most profound change in my life from high school forward.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for the interview.
You're welcome.